crunched on the frostbitten ground, each sound echoing in the oppressive silence that surrounded me. I shouldn't have come here. I knew at the moment I stepped off the bus and onto the deserted road leading to Black Hollow, but I had no choice. The letter had been clear, its words etched into my mind like a curse. Come alone. Come at midnight, or you'll never see her again. The trees grew denser as I ventured deeper into the woods, their gnarled roots twisting out of the earth like serpents waiting to strike. My breath came in shallow bursts, visible in the frigid air, and my heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give me away. To whom, I didn't know. The woods were empty, or at least they seemed to be, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck that made me glance over my shoulder every few steps. Nothing, just shadows and the endless, suffocating darkness. The letter hadn't said where to go, only to come to Black Hollow. I had assumed it meant the old abandoned church at the edge of the woods, a place I hadn't seen since I was a child. My grandmother used to warn me about it, her voice trembling as she spoke of the things that lurked there. The Devil's Chapel, she called it, a place where the dead don't rest. I had laughed at her stories back then, dismissing them as the ramblings of an old woman. But now, as I trudged through the woods with the weight of the unknown pressing down on me, I wasn't so sure. The church loomed into view, its steeple jagged and broken against the night sky. The once white walls were now stained with moss and rot, the windows shattered and gaping like empty eye sockets. The heavy wooden door hung ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I hesitated at the threshold, my hand trembling as I reached for the flashlight in my pocket. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a scene of decay and neglect. The pews were overturned, the altar cracked and splintered, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and sharp. Hello. My voice echoed through the empty space, bouncing off the walls and returning to me in a distorted whisper. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind whistling through the broken windows. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing loudly on the stone floor. The beam of my flashlight danced across the walls, revealing faded murals of angels and demons locked in eternal battle. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, their expressions twisting into something malevolent in the flickering light. I was about to call out again when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against wood. It was coming from the far end of the church, near the altar. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would burst. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, a mixture of anger and hunger that sent a shiver down my spine. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't coming from the church. It was coming from beneath it. My flashlight beam dropped to the floor, revealing a trapdoor partially hidden beneath a tattered rug. The wood was old and splintered, the iron ring handle rusted and stained with something dark. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, to leave this cursed place and never look back. But I couldn't, not without her. I grabbed the handle, the metal cold and rough against my palm, and pulled. The trapdoor groaned in protest, the hinges screeching as it opened to reveal a set of narrow, crumbling stairs descending into the darkness. The smell that wafted up was nauseating, a mixture of rot and decay that made my stomach churn. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and I realized with a start that it wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping and intertwining, a cacophony of despair and rage. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the stairs, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The air grew colder with each step, the walls closing in around me until I felt like I was descending into the belly of some great, ancient beast. The stairs ended in a narrow corridor, the walls lined with rusted iron doors, each one marked with strange symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the light. The whispering was deafening now, the voices clawing at my mind, urging me to turn back, to leave while I still could. But I couldn't, not when I was so close. I moved down the corridor, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. The doors were all closed except for one at the very end, its hinges twisted and broken, as if something had forced its way out. My flashlight beam flickered as I approached, the light growing dimmer with each step. I shook it, willing it to stay on, but the beam continued to weaken until it was little more than a faint glow. The door was just ahead, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold, rough wood, and pushed it open. The beam of my flashlight died completely as I stepped inside, plunging me into total darkness. I fumbled with the switch, but it was no use. The light was gone. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. I stood there, frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and waited. For what? I didn't know. But I could feel it, something in the darkness, something ancient and malevolent, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. And then I heard it, a soft, wet sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. It was close, too close, and I stumbled back, my heart racing. The sound stopped, and for a moment there was nothing. And then, from the darkness, came a voice I recognized, one that sent a wave of terror crashing over me. "You shouldn't have come," it said, and I knew then that I was no longer alone. The voice echoed in the darkness, a sound so familiar it made my blood run cold. It was her, Emily, my sister, but it wasn't her. Not really. There was something wrong with the way she spoke, the words slithering out of her mouth, like they didn't belong to her. The voice was hers, but the tone was all wrong, hollow, lifeless, and dripping with malice. I stumbled back, my hands flailing in the dark, searching for something, anything to hold on to. My foot caught on something soft and yielding, and I fell hard, my knees slamming into the cold, damp stone floor. The impact sent a jolt of pain up my legs, but I barely registered it. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the darkness was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. "Emily," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Is that you?" There was no answer, only the sound of her breathing, shallow, ragged, and too close. I scrambled to my feet, my hands still searching blindly in the dark. My fingers brushed against something wet and sticky, and I recoiled, wiping my hand on my coat. The metallic smell of blood filled the air, thick and cloying, and I felt bile rise in my throat. I took a step back, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would burst out of my chest. The darkness seemed to pulse around me, alive and malevolent, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I wasn't alone. There were others here, things that moved in the shadows. Their presence felt more than seen. I could hear them now, the soft rustle of movement, the faint scrape of claws against stone. They were circling me, closing in, and I had nowhere to run. "Why did you come?" Emily's voice came again, closer this time. "You were supposed to stay away." "I came for you," I said, my voice breaking. "I got your letter. I thought you were in trouble." Her laughter was a harsh, grating sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "I am in trouble," she said, "but not the kind you can save me from." The floor beneath me shifted, the stone cracking and groaning, as if the earth itself was waking up. I stumbled, catching myself against the wall, and felt something move beneath my hand, something warm and pulsing, like flesh. I jerked my hand away, my stomach churning, and took a step forward. My foot landed in something wet, and I heard a sickening squelch as I pulled it free. The smell was unbearable, a mixture of rot and decay that made my eyes water. I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve, and tried to steady my breathing. I needed to think, to find a way out of this nightmare, but the darkness was disorienting, and the whispers were back, louder now, more insistent. "You shouldn't have come," Emily said again, her voice closer still. "Now you're one of us. What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice rising in panic. "Emily, what's going on? Where are you?" There was a soft, wet sound, like something dragging itself across the floor, and then I felt her hand on my arm. Her skin was cold and clammy. her grip like iron. I tried to pull away, but she held on tight, her fingers digging into my flesh. I could feel her breath on my face, hot and rancid, and I turned my head away, gagging. "Look at me," she said, her voice a low growl. "Look at what they've done to me." I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to close my eyes, to turn and run, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't obey. Slowly, reluctantly, I turned my head and opened my eyes. The darkness seemed to part, revealing her face inches from mine. I stifled a scream, my stomach lurching at the sight. Her eyes were gone, replaced by empty, gaping sockets that oozed black ichor. Her skin was pale and bloated, her lips pulled back in a grotesque grin that revealed rows of jagged, broken teeth. Her hair hung in matted clumps, and her neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, as if it had been broken and then hastily put back together. She was unrecognizable, a grotesque mockery of the sister I had known. "Emily," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What happened to you?" "They took me," she said, her voice a hollow rasp. "They took me, and now they want you." "Who?" I asked, my mind racing. "Who took you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she let go of my arm and stepped back, her movements jerky and unnatural. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I realized with a sinking feeling that they were coming from her, from the empty sockets where her eyes should have been. The sound was unbearable, a cacophony of voices that clawed at my mind, filling it with images of death and despair. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside my head, whispering things I couldn't understand but knew were evil. The floor beneath me shifted again, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. The stone cracked and splintered, revealing something beneath, something alive. Tendrils of black smoke rose from the cracks, twisting and writhing like serpents. They reached for me, their touch cold and slimy, and I scrambled back, my hands slipping in the wet, sticky substance that covered the floor. The tendrils followed, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were savoring the hunt. I could feel them wrapping around my legs, their grip tightening, pulling me down. I kicked and thrashed, but it was no use. They were too strong. "Emily," I screamed, my voice raw with panic. "Help me." But she just stood there, her grotesque face twisted in a smile. "You shouldn't have come," she said again. "Now you're one of us." The tendrils pulled me down, their cold, slimy touch spreading across my body. I could feel them inside me, burrowing into my flesh, filling me with a cold, numbing darkness. My vision blurred, the edges of my consciousness fraying as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I fought to stay awake, to hold on to myself, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong, too hungry. It consumed me, pulling me under, and the last thing I saw was Emily's face, her empty sockets staring into mine as the whispers filled my mind. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold stone floor, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. My body felt heavy, my limbs sluggish, as if I had been asleep for a long time. I tried to sit up, but my arms gave out, and I collapsed back onto the floor. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay, and I could hear the whispers again, faint but insistent. They were coming from the walls, from the floor, from inside my head. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it was no use. The voices were everywhere, their words a jumble of fear and despair. I forced myself to sit up, my head spinning, and looked around. The room was different now, larger, darker, and filled with things I couldn't quite make out. Shadows moved in the corners, their shapes shifting and twisting, and I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. The walls were covered in strange symbols, their lines glowing faintly in the darkness, and I realized with a start that they were the same symbols I had seen on the doors upstairs. They pulsed with a faint, sickly light, their patterns twisting and writhing like living things. I got to my feet, my legs trembling, and took a step forward. The floor was slick with something wet and sticky, and I had to fight to keep my balance. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I realized with a sinking feeling that they were guiding me, leading me deeper into the darkness. I didn't want to go, but I had no choice. My body moved on its own, my feet carrying me forward, step by agonizing step. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in around me as I walked. The symbols grew brighter, their light casting strange, shifting shadows on the floor. I could feel the darkness pressing in on me, its weight crushing, suffocating. The whispers were deafening now, their words a jumble of fear and despair, and I realized with a start that they were coming from the symbols. They were alive, their voices a chorus of pain and suffering. I reached the end of the corridor and found myself in a large, circular room. The walls were covered in the same glowing symbols, their light casting an eerie glow on the scene before me. The floor was covered in a thick, black liquid that bubbled and hissed, and in the center of the room was a large, stone altar. On the altar lay a figure, its body twisted and broken, its face hidden in shadow. I took a step forward, my heart pounding, and realized with a start that it was Emily. Her body was covered in the same black liquid, her skin pale and bloated, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Her head was turned to the side, her empty sockets staring into the darkness, and I could see the faint rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. She was alive, but barely. I took another step forward, my hand reaching out to touch her, but before I could, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, the absence of sound more terrifying than the whispers had been. I stood there, frozen, my hand hovering over Emily's body, and waited. For what? I didn't know. But I could feel it, something in the darkness, something ancient and malevolent, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. And then, from the shadows, came a voice that wasn't Emily's, but one I recognized all the same. It was deep and guttural, its words dripping with malice and hunger. "Welcome," it said. "We've been waiting for you." In the dead of night, with the moon obscured by dense, roiling clouds, I found myself standing at the threshold of a decrepit mansion that had long been abandoned. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread, and the wind howled through the gnarled trees that surrounded the property. The mansion's windows were broken, and the once grand entrance was now marred by rot and decay. As I pushed open the creaking door, it emitted an agonizing groan that echoed through the empty halls, setting my nerves on edge. Inside, the air was stale, and the darkness seemed to suffocate any remnants of light. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, but curiosity and an unexplainable pull compelled me to proceed further into the mansion's depths. My footsteps echoed eerily on the dust-covered floorboards, and every creak and groan of the old house seemed to whisper of long-forgotten secrets. The sense of being watched grew stronger with each step I took, and I couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were tracking my every move. The grand staircase loomed before me, its steps warped and splintered with age. I placed my hand on the banister, feeling the rough texture of the wood beneath my fingers, and began to ascend. With each step, the floorboards beneath me groaned as if protesting my presence. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched out before me, lined with closed doors and adorned with faded, peeling wallpaper. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional drip of water from a leaky roof. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed that the doors were numbered, but in no particular order. Some were marked with strange symbols that I couldn't decipher. One door in particular caught my attention, a heavy oak door with an intricate carving of an eye. The sense of foreboding intensified as I reached for the doorknob, and the cold metal sent a shiver down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling, before summoning the courage to turn the knob and push the door open. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, and the stench of mold and decay assaulted my senses. I fumbled for a light switch, but found none. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small flashlight. The beam of light pierced the darkness, revealing a room filled with old, tattered furniture and scattered papers. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. As I approached the mirror, I noticed that the papers strewn about the room contained fragmented journal entries, all written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. The entries spoke of nightmares, of voices whispering in the dark, and of a presence that haunted the mansion. My pulse quickened as I read, and an unshakable sense of dread settled over me. I glanced up at the mirror, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of movement in its reflection. The flashlight's beam wavered as my hand shook, and I took a step closer to the mirror. The dust obscured my reflection, but as I wiped away the grime with my sleeve, my heart nearly stopped. Staring back at me was not my own reflection, but a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure with a look of sheer terror etched into its features. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, and the figure in the mirror seemed to move closer, its eyes locking onto mine. Panic surged through me, and I tore my gaze away from the mirror, only to find that the room had grown colder, and the sense of being watched had intensified. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut.